one day I found a plagiarized PhD thesis. So a thesis that had the introduction had plagiarized text. And just by accident, I flipped through the rest of the thesis PDF and found 2 duplicated blots that looked identical, except one of the blots had been mirrored. So it was like in mirror image. And I recognized that blot. It had a little dot on it that I recognized. It was very specific. And I thought, in combination with the plagiarism in the introduction, I immediately suspected that this was done intentionally.
Welcome to the 42nd episode of the Struggling Scientist podcast. We are a podcast by scientists, for scientists, anybody science adjacent, and perhaps even hobbyists. My name is Susanne, and I'm here with my co-host Jeroen.
Hi.
Today, we have a very exciting new episode. We're going to talk about fraud in science, and more specifically, image tampering. And to get to the bottom of this, we have a very special guest who is an expert in this subject, namely Elisabeth Bik.
Hello.
So let's start. We're very excited to have you here.
I'm super excited to be here. Excited to hear questions.
It's also nice to have a Dutch person for a change, even though you're at the other side of the world, basically. But
Hallo allemaal, ik spreek nog steeds Nederlands.
Yes. Okay. Now, before we get into the main topic of this episode, we always like to ask our guests to introduce themselves, because it's always so telling what they want us to know about them, of course. So could you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself? Where do you come from, live now, any interesting hobbies that you have, or anything else that you like?
So my name is Elisabeth Bik. I was born and raised in the Netherlands, born in Gouda, and did my PhD in Utrecht University. Mm-hmm. But I actually worked at the Dutch National Institute of Health, RIVM. That's where I did my PhD on Vibrio cholera. So I'm a microbiologist. I also worked at the Sint Antonius Ziekenhuis in Nieuwegein. And then I moved to the US. That was about 20 years ago. And I worked 15 years of those 20 years at Stanford as a staff scientist, first as a postdoc and then later as a staff scientist on the microbiome of humans and dolphins and sea lions. Yes, dolphins. We can talk about that too. And then while I was working there, I got interested in research integrity. We can talk about that later. But I worked also 2 years in biotech, and I quit my job in 2019. And so I'm not employed. I don't have a boss. Lovely. And I am a consultant specializing in image duplications in scientific papers. And my hobbies, I collect turtles. So I have behind me, you cannot see that in the podcast, but I have behind me a collection of around 2,000 turtles.
Wow.
Little ones, tortoises made of wood, of stone, clay, porcelain, whatever. No real ones. And I like to garden. I like to work in the backyard, especially like big work, like putting in sprinklers, repairing sprinklers. Here in California, where we live, we need, in the summer, we don't get any rain, so we need sprinklers. And so I've learned how to repair and put in new sprinklers.
Very useful skill.
I already have 2 questions based on what you just said.
We won't be bored here.
So first off, why the microbiome of dolphins? And second off, is there a logic to the collecting of tortoises or turtles? What's the...
Well, we could start with that. So when I was in elementary school, I don't know, I was like 8 years, 10 years old, whatever. And all the girls in my class started to collect something. That was, that was the thing back then. And so one person collected rabbits or dogs and then, like porcelain little statues, miniatures of those animals. So my best friend and I we're also enthusiastic about collecting something, but we had to come up with what are we going to collect? This is an important life choice.
Yes.
But we also thought, well, cats and dogs and bunnies, those are way too easy.
Yeah.
You can find them everywhere. And back then, turtles. And so I chose turtles because my parents had a tortoise in the backyard, 3 ones actually. And so I decided to collect turtles and tortoises. And my best friend chose hedgehogs, egels. So there was we wanted to make it really hard on ourselves. And back then you couldn't find a lot of turtles that wasn't very
Especially not in
popular.
the
Now
Netherlands.
they're much easier to find. But so, and the funny thing is that all the other girls quickly stopped doing that after a year or so. But then we kept on going. So
Commitment.
we're now in our 50s and we still have our hedgehogs and I have my turtles. I'm not I don't collect them actively anymore. But if somebody gives me a turtle, it's going to get a good home in my cabinet behind me.
Yes.
Oh, wow. Amazing.
And the other question was about why the microbiome of dolphins.
Yes.
So I worked at Stanford. We worked on the microbiome of humans. That was, we wanted to know which bacteria live inside our bodies. We started with the gut or stool samples, poop samples. We also did oral samples in our mouth and then gastric samples. And so I published this paper on the gastric microbiome, one of the first papers on that topic. And then we were contacted by the US Navy, who manages a group of dolphins in San Diego that are trained to find underwater objects. This is no secret information. This is all public. But these animals were trained sort of similar to sniffing dogs. They were trained because they can make deep dives. They have a sonar system. They can find underwater objects. They were trained to find things like sea mines and then tell the divers up in the boat that there was an underwater object that needed to be deactivated, for example. So the group of researchers who worked with these dolphins were very interested in what we were doing with humans. And so they asked, can you do that with dolphins too? And we're like, sure, just send us the samples. We'll, we extract the DNA and we do the sequencing. It doesn't really matter what type of samples it is. Mm-hmm. So I did that. And one time I actually got to visit the dolphins, but I didn't sample themselves. That was all done by trained veterinarians. And we got lots of samples from blowholes and skin and mouth and poop sample. Well, poop samples is hard because you cannot really swim around the dolphin and wait until it poops. But you can carefully sample its basically its butt, the rectal hole. So we got lots of samples. We also got samples of the fish they were eating and of seawater. So it was a very exciting project, and we got that published a couple of years ago.
Oh, nice!
A lot of fun, also.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So I was actually also wondering. You're obviously an expert in finding papers with images that have been manipulated in some way or tampered in some way, and from what I've been able to tell as well, that your work has already led to over 900 retractions as well as over 900 corrections, which is obviously amazing and great scientific work that contributes to the scientific community. But could you also tell us and maybe our listeners what got you started with this and how has it evolved over the years a little bit?
Yeah, so I was still working at Stanford. In 2013, I got interested in plagiarism. I forgot exactly what it was that got me interested, but I just decided, hey, did somebody actually sometimes plagiarize my work? So I typed in a sentence from a paper I had written, a review article on the microbiome. And I typed in that sentence or like a string of words from that sentence between quotes in Google Scholar, not expecting to find anything, but other than my own paper. But I found another hit. I found actually two hits. An InTech Open article that was sort of these online books. And that had stolen my sentence, basically a whole paragraph. And it had stolen sentences from other papers as well. And these researchers also published a paper with my sentence. So there were two hits that were not my own paper. And so I got so mad.
Yeah.
Like, these people stole my sentence. Come on.
Yeah.
And I started looking into plagiarized articles, and I did that for a year. Long story, but one day I found a plagiarized PhD thesis. So a thesis that had the introduction had plagiarized text. And just by accident, I flipped through the rest of the thesis PDF and found two duplicated blots that looked identical, except one of the blots had been mirrored. So it was like in mirror image. And I recognized that blot. It had a little dot on it that I recognized. It was very specific. And I thought, in combination with the plagiarism in introduction, I immediately suspected that this was done intentionally. And these papers had been published. The PhD thesis chapters had been published. And there were several examples of duplicated images. So I reported these papers, and I also wanted to know how often does this happen? These images have been published in papers. Do we more often see duplications either within or across papers of images? Or do we even see image duplications within a photo, which is even worse? So I started to be interested in that, and I just opened a bunch of papers on my desktop that had the word Western blot in it, because the image I had found was a Western blot. And I started finding some of these examples, and I started doing that. In the end, I screened 20,000 papers and found 800 papers with duplicated images.
Wow.
Yeah.
And this was a hobby project. I was still working full-time at Stanford, so it wasn't it wasn't my full-time job. I did this in the evenings and weekends.
I'm impressed with that amount of commitment and work. Just 20. When I hear that amount of, like, I can register the number, but I can't imagine the amount of papers that actually is when you see it like that. Wow.
Yeah, that's a lot.
But I only looked at the images, so I didn't read the papers. I just scanned images, and some papers. So what I did is I scanned for the word Western blot. Started with +1 papers, because they were easy to find at home. They're open access. So I did, you can easily open them. And some of these papers only have 1 or 2 photos. So you're very quickly done reading. You don't read them. I just look at the images. So some of them would take less than a minute once you have them open. The opening of the PDFs actually took more time sometimes than the actual scanning.
And back then you mostly looked within one paper, right? You didn't go looking for all the other papers yet.
It's hard to really know if an image has been used in other papers just using your eyes. There's no way a human can remember all images ever published.
Yeah.
And at that time, I was still using my eyes. So I limited myself to duplications within a paper for my initial screen, because I wanted to get that published. So I wanted to do it in a way that other people could repeat it, a reproducible way. I wanted to really write down what I did. So I screened for Western blot, that word between quotes. I screened if a paper did not contain an image, I didn't look at it, I didn't count it. And it had to have a duplication within that paper.
And then you already found so many. That's crazy.
800, yes, 4%. Yeah.
Did you know when you started it that you wanted to maybe publish it, whatever the results might end up being? Or did you figure out, okay, I have 200 potential papers already, maybe let's systematize this a little bit to get it published?
Not the first day. I just thought, hey, does this happen more often? But I guess, I don't know, maybe I've been a scientist too long. I thought, well, we need to, it's disturbing that this happened, that this passes through peer review. And I think within a couple of days of scanning papers, at night, I thought I should do this in a way that is reproducible and so I can publish it. So I should keep track of how many papers I've scanned and how many papers I've found. And I should also not publish this by myself, because there's no way I can publish this by myself. Nobody's going to believe me that I found these duplications. And so I realized I need to have 2 co-authors who have to approve of the duplications that I found. So I found a team of 2 persons active in microbiology and also editors-in-chief of ASM, American Society for Microbiology journals, Arturo Casadeval and Ferric Fang. They were both professors and they were both editors-in-chief of journals. So they were very experienced, and they had published about retractions and about, they were both working in microbiology, my home field. And so they seemed to be a very logical couple to try to get interested in my work. And at first they were like, we're not sure. You see these things, we don't see it really. But I think gradually I could convince them that what I was seeing were really duplications and sometimes just honest errors. It can happen, but some of them looked like they were intentionally done. And so after we had some hefty discussions, but we agreed that all the things that I found, they had to both agree with. And if one of them did not agree, or both of them did not agree that it was a duplication, then I had to toss it out. I'm still convinced I was right in some of these cases, but this was the agreement that we came up with. And so the 800 papers that we found, we agreed with all 3 of us that these were duplications. inappropriate duplications. So not duplications that were quite all right, but duplications where the same image or part of the same image had been used to represent two different experiments.
Yeah, or completely different condition or like.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
And now since then you have also started using computer programs, I think, right, to analyze more quickly. So how has it evolved since that you started with this paper?
So in that the paper that I published in 2016, where I scanned those 20,000 papers, that was all done by eye. There was, of course, I used the computer to open the files and to mark them with colored boxes where the duplications were. But I found them by just looking at them myself. In a couple of years ago, I would say about 2 years ago, I started using software. So I'm using Image Twin. It's a program that is using AI, artificial intelligence. I have no idea how it works, but it does find duplications. And it's quite good in finding duplications in those panels where you have lots of, let's say, microscopy photos of tissues or cells. It's amazingly good. And it finds in those types of images, it finds tiny overlaps. It finds rotational overlaps or mirrored overlaps as well. And it also has a database of some images of the public PubMed Central, so open access images. And occasionally it will find an overlap with another paper. But it also has a lot of false positives. So a lot of these I don't think there's a duplication, especially in Western blots. It's just not very good in those. And so I still need to scan all these papers myself, but it helps me. It's so quick. Like you just dump in the PDF and within seconds it says, oh, there's a duplication there, there's a duplication there. But I still need to check it. You cannot blindly rely on the software. But it's very helpful. And I bet if I would scan those 20,000 papers again, which I'm not going to do, it would find more duplications than I would ever find myself.
Yeah.
So you're primarily using it now as a sort of a screening tool to sort of pinpoint and
I use it on complex papers with lots of images, and I use it if there's just one image, I'll just look at it myself. But if it has either lots of different Western blots or it has a lot of one of those panels with five rows and 10 columns or so with images, then I use it for that. So for these more complex papers, I will just drag the PDF into the software and it will look at the duplications. But sometimes it costs me more time because it flags a lot of false positives. So you have to sort of click through them like, okay, no, these are fine, these are fine, these are fine. But then, hey, it did find a duplication. And so it's helpful. It has definitely found a lot more than I would find myself. But the false positives are in a way also slowing me down. Yeah. But, this is new software. It's in development. I'm sure it will get better. And in the end, of course, software is going to be able to screen much more than a human can.
Yeah, well, hopefully also it could be checked before papers get published in the future. It would be so nice if it would be possible, right? So you published your 4% of papers that you found with a duplication in 2016. Do you think it's the same amount these days? Do you think it's even more? How do you feel about it now that you have been doing this for a while?
Yeah, it's hard to tell. So I think I'm only catching the tip of the iceberg because I did this screen by eye, so I probably have missed a lot. And if it was a duplication, a reuse of an image from another paper, I would not have found that. So the 4% was papers that had duplicated images that were inappropriate duplications. We estimated about half of those, so 2% of these papers that are screened, were done intentionally, where, for example, an image was rotated or mirrored, or where an image had duplicated elements like cells or blood bands within the same photo. So those are, very likely to have been done intentionally. So our estimate initially was that 2% of the papers that I screened, so those were only papers that contained photos, those papers contained intentionally misleading data. So and then we were trying to say, does that mean that 2% of all papers contains misconduct? And the number is probably much higher. Like I said, I only catch the tip of the iceberg. I only catch things in images. But manipulation in things like line graphs, bar graphs, ordination plot, heat maps. I have no idea, if that has been tampered with. It's much harder to tell. So sorry for this very long answer to your question. So your question is, is this getting worse or better? I think on one hand, since our paper got published, I think a lot of people realize, oh, wait, we should not be doing this because Elisabeth Bik is going to catch us. It leaves something that she can find, right? Like we should fraud better. So I do think on one hand, I'm sure there's still a lot of this going on. People are just bad at photoshopping or moving the sample under the microscope a little bit more. So there's no overlap for me to find. But on the other hand, I do think there's a huge increase in what we call paper mills, which are completely fake papers, not necessarily with images, but that are papers that are either plagiarized of other papers or completely making fake data using AI or just a human based on a template. And so we see a large influx of these, what we believe are fake papers. And these papers are very similar, and they leave traces that they're fake, and which are hard to find. But there's several people working on these paper mills, and I think there's thousands of these papers, polluting basically the scientific literature. And I think that's a very recent development, and it's driven by certain countries that have very strict requirements for scientists to publish their results. So it's for example, in China, there's a requirement to publish a scientific paper in order to get either a position at a clinical hospital for a medical doctor or to get a promotion. And these medical doctors are not necessarily interested in research. So they'll just buy a paper. They see advertisements on social media in China where paper mills advertise their services. And these medical doctors are desperate to have a paper. They don't have time to write a paper, but they just want to invest in their career. And so they will buy a paper, which is a completely fake paper. And these papers are there's a great influx of these papers in scientific literature. So I think fraud in general is on the rise based on increased pressure to publish and sometimes impossible requirements for people to publish.
Yeah, crazy. I also think it's very funny that you say that they are frauding better, because I have been following you on Twitter, of course, and I sometimes see these images where you can literally see till the edges of where they copy-pasted it in, and I'm like, why are you doing it so badly?
Put some effort.
Well, the people who did put in effort, I'm not able to find them. I really only catch the dumb fraudsters, the ones who leave traces. Yes.
But that's even more worrying, right? To think,
It is, yes. Because most scientists are smart, right? Like we agree that scientists are, in general, pretty smart people. So I think a lot of people are, there's many ways to fraud that do not leave any traces. Not going to give anybody any ideas, but if you Photoshop your image and you publish that leaves traces for others to find.
Yeah. So when you find a case of image fraud, what does the follow-up steps look like? What can you do from then? And do you think journals and institutes are taking it serious or serious enough?
Oh, no, they don't take it serious enough. So what you're supposed to do is write to the editor-in-chief of the journal in which it was published. So you, first you have to hunt down who the editor-in-chief is of the journal. Then you have to find their email address, and they sometimes hide that. I'm trying to think if that's on purpose or not. But anyway, once you have found the editor-in-chief, you can write to the journal. And sometimes journals also have contact addresses. It depends a little bit on the publisher. So then you can write to the editor-in-chief and saying, I have a concern about this and this paper, and I think that figure 2A looks like figure 3B. Here's a little PDF with the illustration. And then you hope, of course, that the editor will then contact the author. I would not recommend contacting the author yourself. That usually doesn't, result in a fruitful discussion. But do it through the editor. Then the author is supposed to respond. There's a corresponding email, corresponding author email on most papers. And then they get a chance to prove that the allegations were wrong by perhaps sending in the original blot or higher resolution photo or so. And then what could follow is either a correction if there was an error and the author was able to prove that it was an error, like, oh, sorry, yes, we did upload the wrong photo, here's the right one. Or the paper can get retracted or receive an expression of concern if the editor is not happy with the author's reply. Now, this is all the ideal case. There's many things that can go wrong here. For example, in my experience, a lot of editors don't even reply when I send my concerns to them. And then they might contact the authors, but the authors are not responding. And this is sort of where the whole flow chart of what everybody should do ends and doesn't lead to a resolution. Because authors, of course, move to a different institution, their email address doesn't work, or they might just not feel like answering this somewhat inconvenient question. And so they might not answer on purpose. So it's hard to tell the difference. And then sometimes authors will send in a new photoshopped image or something better, and the editor might believe that this is, but yeah, there's many reasons that can go wrong. So in my experience, this initial set where I scanned 20,000 papers and I found 800 papers with problems confirmed by 2 other people, those 800 papers, I reported all of them to the editor-in-chief in 2015. Then I waited 5 years. I sent some reminders like, hey, my paper, did you look at my, remember my email? I'm still here. Did you look at it? And 5 years later, 2/3 of those 800 papers had not been acted upon. No correction, no retraction, no expression of concern. Nothing happened, at least from my point of view. I don't know what the editors did. So only 1/3 had been received a correction or a retraction. And now we're, 2-3 years later, that number is still on the rise. There's still a couple of papers that are from that set that are getting either retracted or corrected. But the number is still below 50%. So more than half of the papers, even after waiting 7 years, are not acted upon. And that's just a very sad number. It seems that there is an inability or lack of willingness of editors to respond to these allegations.
Do you feel it's better in certain journals than in others? Do certain journals respond better than others? And is there an impact factor difference or?
It's hard to tell because I think the numbers that I have per paper, per journal are probably too low to do any real statistics on it. I feel that journals in general do bad across the board. All journals do bad. But in some cases, there are journals that respond really fast, quickly in certain papers, but then fail to respond to other papers. So it doesn't seem to be completely tied to a journal or impact factor, but it seems to be more tied perhaps to the editor handling these allegations or the age of the paper. If a paper is very old, of course, who can find the authors and who can find the original blots. That's probably all gone. And perhaps there might be conflicts of interest with certain papers. So I can imagine that an editor is maybe very willing to retract a paper from an author they have never worked with and they don't know personally. But they might be not so willing to work on a paper if the author is their best buddy or they hung out with them at a conference, drank a beer together and tapped on each other's back and liked each other professionally. And then, if somebody is then raising some concerns about their paper, then maybe the editor thinks, well, but that was a nice guy or a nice gal. I'm not gonna, bring them into trouble. So I think there's also conflicts of interest, but no big correlation between impact factor and responses. There was a correlation actually between the percentage of problems in these journals and their impact factor. So the higher the impact factor in general, the lower the amount of problems. But it could just mean that they're better fraudsters in those journals. The authors are, the authors are smarter maybe in who submit their papers to high impact journals.
Okay, now we also know that you sometimes investigate a whole line of papers from a specific author or even from a group. What do you think are the reasons for these serious offenders to do this?
Well, I imagine that some people are just fraudsters, and they, you fraud once and you get away with it. I think it becomes easier to fraud again. And this is exactly what Diederik Stapel wrote in his book. So I think a lot of people might be familiar with this case. He was a professor at Tilburg University. He worked in psychology. And it was after several rounds of whistleblowers, it came out that he had completely fabricated his data. And he has now over 50 papers retracted. And he admitted that he made up this data. Like, I'm not making any false accusations here. And he wrote a book about it, why he did it. And in his book, he wrote, well, the first time you fabricate data, he made just some numbers up in a spreadsheet and made some graphs and convincing looking results.
Mm-hmm.
The first time he was, sweating and like, oh, somebody's going to find out. Like, I hope nobody finds out. But then it got published and he got on television and he could talk about his work. Everybody was cheering and he suddenly was famous. And he said the second time it just becomes easier. Just keep on doing it because I think success is addictive, and these people, there's a very low chance of being caught. He was caught, but I think in general, the chance of getting caught if you are doing fraud in science are very low. And if you get caught, the repercussions are even lower. There seems to be little consequences for anyone's career when they do it, especially when they're a senior researcher.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard of a senior researcher indeed like getting, except for him, of course, getting kicked out.
Very few.
I do know some stories about postdocs and things like that who are kicked out of their career, of course, but for like real PIs, no, indeed, no.
Yeah. So now it's also not necessarily the case that it's always the first author that you investigate, I guess, but sometimes also the last. What do you think happens in these groups that lead to sort of image duplication or fraud? What's the sort of group dynamic you think that leads to that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think I sort of picture a bully as a group leader, a demanding professor who does not want to hear that he or she is wrong. And so they have a very strict hypothesis and they demand that all the experiments will fit their hypothesis. So if a junior person in their group, a postdoc or a graduate student, comes to this professor with their results and the professor thinks, well, that's not what I had expected, the professor might actually say something to the grad student like, I had not expected these results, go back and give me the results that fit my hypothesis. Maybe not using those exact words, but almost, and maybe threatening to fire them. And maybe this is not super important in Europe, where I think in most countries, people are a little bit more protected in their, employment. But in the US, if you get fired and you are on a visa, so you are a foreign student working in the US and you get fired by your boss, that means that your visa immediately ends. Your visa is dependent on your sponsor. I mean, it's all like the rules there in the US. And so that means that if you get fired, you have to pack up your stuff and go back to your country within a week or so, like a very short period. So if you're threatened to be fired and you're a foreign student or foreign postdoc or foreign grad student, so you on a visa, you would be scared to shit, to get fired. And so you would be very willing to please the professor and then maybe Photoshop or do some other fraud to make the results look the way the professor wants it. So I'm sort of always picturing this image, and I think it's a very realistic image, a realistic situation, because professors have a lot of power. There's so much hierarchy in academia. We're very dependent when we're earlier in our career on that letter of recommendation or a positive note by the professor to get into our next step of our career, or that paper that we need in order to leave the lab. So bullying, nasty, not mentoring, but ruling by fear type of professors would be sort of a petri dish for fraud, not fraud done by the professor themselves. So they can wash their hands like, oh, we're clean, we didn't do anything. And you see these string of papers being retracted, or just a string of papers with image problems, all by different first authors, but all with the same last author. And I feel that's one of those situations where, yes, maybe the person who did the photoshopping was the first author, the junior scientist, mostly in biology. But it's in the end, it's the senior author who's ultimately responsible for the integrity of the data and the mentoring of that lab. And so it's I feel that those persons, the senior persons, need to be held responsible, because when somebody is your boss and tells you what to do and threatens to fire you if you don't do it, you cannot really blame the junior person for doing something wrong. You should blame the senior person.
It's also crazy that sometimes you actually need multiple people to actually say something before it's taken seriously. Also in like those cases. Even if one person would come forward, it's not enough.
No, absolutely. And that is like in the case of Diederik Stapel, it took 2 groups of whistleblowers to finally get the concerns be taken seriously. So the first group was not believed. They were sort of sent away with saying, like, the university said, we didn't find anything wrong, go away. And then it was a couple of years later that a new group of graduate students or people working in his lab got the courage to raise the concerns again. And then they were believed. And it turned out they were right. And the first group was also right. So, and we've seen a similar situation in the case of Jan Hendrik Schön, who was a physicist at Bell Labs in the US. And he fabricated a lot of his results. He had fantastic results. They looked beautiful, everybody. And he published in Nature and Science and like top of the line journals. And several rounds of people came up and went to his bosses and said, we think these results are way too beautiful. We never see this guy work in the lab. Like, how can he even have obtained these measurements? And they were not believed. It took, I think, I don't know how many. I read the book, Plastic Fantastic. Can recommend that if you want to read about the long road to get a person nailed for misconduct. Plastic Fantastic is a book that is very good to read. But yeah, it shows you how many times whistleblowers are not believed initially.
Yeah, crazy. Well, it should be so important in science to check it, at least.
You would think that reproducibility would be top concern.
You would think.
No.
But universities more and more, or companies, are very concerned about bringing in money. And I feel that universities are more and more turning into these factories of raking in money and, worrying a little bit about their reputation, but not too much about the quality of science as long as it sells. And so professors or group leaders who bring in lots of grant money are almost protected against being investigated, because those are what we call in the US the rainmakers. They bring in the money for the universities. And if a junior researcher comes up and saying, I believe that Professor X is, doing nasty, fraudulent things, the university might just think, well, we don't really want to investigate Professor X because they bring in so much money. So they almost give immunity to these people. And we've seen that in the Me Too movement as well, where people who were known sexual harassers but were great directors or great CEOs, they were sort of not investigated because they were so important for the company. And it's a question of, what do you think as a company or a university is more important? In the end, these cases are going to come out, and it's much more damaging for the university to then have to admit that these allegations were not investigated. So in the end, I think it's much better for a university to immediately investigate and take action. But that's,
I think
haven't.
A lot of the responsibility for checking stuff is also put onto the peer review process. And if they say it's okay, well, probably okay. Well, I think peer reviewers also cannot see those things. So
Right.
they're not the only ones who should check, I guess.
Yeah, I hear that often in the response of an author where they say, oh, you raised these concerns 6 years after our paper got published, but it was peer reviewed.
Yeah.
The journal didn't find anything wrong. So who are you to say that there's something wrong? The paper and the peer reviewers approved all our images. And that's just not an argument that I will, be happy with. Like, no, I see these things. I'm a specialist. I look at these things in a very different way. And I think there's a concern. I don't care if your paper has been peer reviewed by 5 people or 10 people. I see these problems. They're very concerning problems. And, I don't care what the peer reviewers saw, because peer reviewers, like you said, are not trained to find these things. They might not see problems. Like, I look at them from a different angle and I see things that maybe they could have seen, but not everybody can. And peer reviewers are also not paid. We do this work as volunteers. We're short on time. What can you expect from that? Like that's not only if you pay a person to do that work, then of course you expect quality. But unfortunately, the demands on peer reviewers are getting higher and higher. Papers are getting more complex. So the process of peer reviewing has become very difficult. I cannot even peer review a paper anymore because they're so complex, these manuscripts. And they would cost me almost days to go over all the data. So I don't have that. Who has that time, right?
Yep.
And there's no benefit of doing it either. You don't get paid, you don't get fame,
No.
you're anonymous.
Exactly.
Now, we know that there's also some quite big cases where you even were in the news and everything that you have been involved in. Could you tell us a little bit about those, if you want, of course?
Yeah, of course. No topic is off limits. I think one of the cases that got in the news a lot is a paper about hydroxychloroquine. And this was early in the pandemic, March 2020. There was a paper published by a group in Marseille, France, that claimed that hydroxychloroquine could be used to treat people with COVID-19. And that paper was just a very small paper, small group of patients. And there were many problems, I thought, with that paper. So I wrote a blog post about it, and I posted my comments also on PubPeer and on Archive or wherever it was published, the preprint. And I found many flaws with that paper. And of course, the senior professor, who I think might fit the profile I just described earlier, that senior professor did not like it that somebody criticized his paper. And he called me all kinds of nasty words on Twitter, in the French Senate. He was heard by the French Senate. After a while, he even raised or filed a complaint against me. And with the French procureur, I'm not sure, I think it's sort of a police report. So he accused me of harassing him and of blackmailing and extorting him, all kinds of nasty things, which I don't know where that came from. I think it was a misinterpretation of a tweet. And he wrote several blog posts. He did several videos about me. Anyway, he's trying to discredit me, but he has not taken away a single concern that I have found, because I started looking for more concerns in his paper, and I found more and more of his papers to be containing either images that had problems or lack of ethical approval, or all kinds of problems in his paper. So I think I posted around 80 of his papers on PubPeer with problems. And of course, he did not take that well. And so that the threat of the lawsuit was quite nasty. We can talk about that maybe, but I didn't give up, and so I didn't go away. So I don't know what will happen. Maybe I'll be sued by him. And I hope I get some support from the scientific community, because I think it's all frivolous. It's just he's trying to silence me by threatening me with lawsuits. But I have received already a lot of outpour from the scientific community supporting my work and saying, she's raising serious concerns. She's not insulting you. She's just raising concerns about your papers. Why do you threaten to sue her? Like, give her what she wants. Give her the original photos and plots and ethical approval. But instead, he's trying to sue me. And I think authors who do that have something to hide.
Yeah.
He does not maybe have original plots. And so he tries to attack the the messenger, the whistleblower. And I think people who immediately attack the whistleblowers are just, I will bite even deeper and I will look harder because there's something that they're trying to hide. So he's not going to silence me and I might be financially ruined trying to defend myself. But I feel somebody should take that risk because I have stood up to him where many other people have been silenced by his threats for lawsuits. But I will fight this till the final fight. And I hope, of course, it will not come to a lawsuit because it's horrible and it will take away so many financial and emotional resources. But I will not be threatened by him to raise critical questions about his research.
Do you think he's more of an outlier, though, in terms of his response with lawsuits? Or have you also encountered other people who are maybe not going to the lawsuit side yet, but are also nasty to you? Or
a couple have been raising or sending vague threats, or I have received a letter of sort of a cease and desist letter where a lawyer wrote me a letter in FedEx envelope, and it comes at your home, and you're like, what is this? And the lawyer asked me to take down a blog post and to take down tweets, or else ... It wasn't quite clear, but it was a veiled threat of a lawsuit. And I just wrote them back. I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm actually going to tweet that you sent this letter to me. So I'm doing the opposite of what they think I will do. And maybe that's very dumb of me from a legal point of view, but I rarely listen to advice. So I did that. And I never heard from them. So I don't know if I'll be served, but I think I had every right to raise concerns about that group of papers. And other authors have threatened to sue. And those were cases I was not involved in, but they have threatened to sue editors if they would retract a paper. There was a case in the social spider field. A researcher, I'm not going to name names, but a researcher working on the social interactions of spiders. And another person found problems in their papers, and people started to dig in and asking for these files and found more and more problems. And so there were many concerns raised, and the author of all these papers threatened to sue the editors. And so they were very hesitant and they were very afraid and actually were not retracting those papers. But I think in the end, this is another case where it seems that person had something to hide. There were many different concerns about his supplemental tables, and they were pretty clear that there were, big concerns about them.
Yeah.
So it's not unique. It actually happens a lot. And especially in the US, of course, people love to sue each other.
Yeah.
it's a whole profession.
It's a rite of passage at this point there, I guess.
But it is scary. Like it's emotionally disturbing for me to, have to deal with these cases, obviously.
I do think, though, when you publish a paper, you put it out in the public domain and other people are allowed to have an opinion about it. So
Of course.
How would you... Yeah, but maybe that's too Dutch thinking of me to not...
Well, I'm very Dutch in the way I act, because I think a lot of Americans would say, well, you're being threatened with a lawsuit, you have to shut up or take down your tweets. And I'm like, no. So maybe I'm very Dutch in raising concerns, even if it affects people who are in powerful position. I think that's a very Dutch thing. We don't really accept authority that much. And even the prime minister or the king should be open to be criticized. And I think that's an intrinsic part of Dutch culture that in the US it's a little bit less ingrained. So,
yeah. So if someone would like to contribute in a similar way as you do, what tools or resources, or how would you suggest that they get started, that they can also help spotting these image duplications or fraudulent papers?
Well, I regularly post on Twitter examples of image problems under the hashtag image forensics. So if you follow me on Twitter, you can sort of train yourself to see if you can spot the duplications as well. So you can earn an emoji award. My Twitter account is currently in private mode because I'm being attacked by a lot of nasty groups. And so got a lot of hate. So I then switched my Twitter to private. But I have lots of followers already. So if you're there, you can see the sort of the challenges. So not everybody can spot the duplications, but if you can, I would encourage you to, look for papers in your own field, and you might not ever find one with problems. Some papers just don't have images or any other data that would immediately raise concerns. But if you do something, post it on pubpeer.com, which is a website where all of us secret detectives will post our concerns about papers, and install the PubPeer plugin, which is a little extension that will work in your browser. For example, if you have Chrome, you install the Chrome extension for PubPeer. And that means if you do a literature search and one of the papers that is on your screen, the DOI has been commented on in PubPeer, you will see a green banner. So you can see that paper has received comments.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
But yeah, so I have on my website, scienceintegritydigest.com, I have a couple of how-to guides. So what you should do if you see a paper with plagiarism, some tools to look for plagiarism or to compare two papers with each other and highlight the results. Some image forensics tools that are freely available, and some that are not freely available, but those the ones I've worked with. And just in general, how to contact an editor, how to post on PubPeer. So I get too many requests. I get lots of requests like, can you post this problem on PubPeer? And I get so many of them. I'm like, no, I cannot possibly do all these requests. So please post it yourself. Create a PubPeer account. It's completely anonymously. I post under my full name, but if you are a junior researcher, I would not recommend that. It's unfortunately not very good for your career. You have to have a lot of stability in your life, because a lot of people, if you criticize other people's papers, you could be getting in trouble. So I wish it was different, but that's just the reality. So post anonymously, but keep it very polite and objective. We are scientists, we can do this, but don't make any accusations. Or if you suspect any of your persons in your environment to do fraud, if you decide to go to your research integrity officer, which most universities or probably all in Europe will have, post them or raise these concerns objectively. Again, do not make accusations. Try to not become too emotionally. It's very hard if you're very directly involved, but keep it stick to the facts, like and that will bring you the farthest. But help me by doing a lot of this yourself. I'm not Superwoman. I cannot take on all the problems in the world, but I hope that others are inspired with what I do and do their own things. There's so many papers out there, I cannot possibly screen them myself.
Do you ever regret doing it so publicly? Because also on social media, you of course have quite a few people spreading hate. Do you
Yes.
do you regret doing it under your full name?
No, absolutely not. I'm 100% behind my own choices. And occasionally I will tweet something and I'm like, that was probably not a very good tweet, so I'll delete the tweet. But that's rare. Like I feel I'm in a privileged position. Obviously, I don't have to worry about my career. I'm in a financial stable position. I get lots of support through Patreon and consulting work. So I have a stable income. I can do this work without having a boss, and I absolutely do not regret it.
I guess it also helps that you're not biased towards anything in that sense, right? Like if you had to worry about your career, that's like, maybe I can, maybe it's analyzed in a certain way or presented a certain way, but you have no biases in that regard either, I guess.
I have
no biases, specific. Most importantly, I don't have a boss who tells me what not to do. Because you can imagine if you are a professor or some group leader and one of your employees is criticizing one of your coworkers, like that usually doesn't go over well. And usually the junior person then will be told, like, don't rock the boat, like don't be so hateful. Don't focus on your work. So I've been told that several times. So I decided at some point I can only do this work really well by quitting my job and hoping to make it as a consultant, which I can do now. So that's but it helps to be a little bit at a point a little bit more senior in your career to do this.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the feedback from the scientific community has been positive for the most part, except for those few exceptions, of course?
Yeah, I do get a lot of hate, but the hate mostly comes from anonymous trolls, either from friends, from that French professor. I'm also having a lot of unkind messages from a group of investors who invested in a company called Cassava Sciences, where the stock jumped because some of their papers have images of concern, and I agreed with that. And so a lot of hate is sending my direction, mainly from people who are not scientists, but from the scientific community. I have received a lot of support. So when I was threatened with that lawsuit by the Marseille professor, there were several petitions started by scientists, and people signed those petitions to support me. And that has meant a lot, because I know I'm not alone. I'm supported by scientists, and I'm hated by trolls. But I think that's a decent balance. If it was the other way around, it would not be good, right?
Yes. Yeah, it's of course always, I would say, also a fear of everybody who's doing any type of science communication or anything online. You always are afraid of those trolls coming for you. But I'm really glad that you also get a lot of support, because it's really important work that you do.
Yeah. But yeah, like I said, the trolls are sometimes, there are, waves of trolls coming at me sometimes. So I shut my Twitter down. So I'm currently in private mode. But I will accept new followers as long as they're scientists. If they are, John Doe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I'm not going to follow them, or I'm not going to let them in right now. But it's I still accept new followers or follower requests. But I mainly put something in your bio, folks. Like if it's just a name, I cannot really judge if I want you to follow me or not, or if I want to follow you. Do a little if your bio has something like I'm a scientist, or I'm interested, like I work in a library, or I'm interested in science, like I'll accept you. But if the bio is empty, I'm not gonna be very tempted to follow you.
Looks like a troll.
It looks like a troll, exactly. Yeah. Like, of course, a lot of trolls would love to see what I'm tweeting now. I'm just tweeting image forensics things and nice art that I like, and a salad that I made yesterday. So I tweet about those things. I try to remain, polite, and it's hard sometimes, but I try not to call out any particular persons unless it's a very severe troll making a very nasty comment anonymously. I feel I have every right to retweet that or to make a screenshot, because I'm not personally attacking a person. It's a troll who chose to be anonymously, so I don't know who they are, and you cannot find that out. But I do feel that those tweets need to be reported, and unfortunately, I don't know what Twitter's future is going to be. We'll see how
it's been an interesting
works
few
out.
Weeks.
Yeah, we'll see.
Well, thank you so much for talking with us today. We learned a lot, and hopefully our listeners too. We can, of course, really recommend our listeners to follow you on Twitter. Your Twitter handle is @Microbiome Digest, if I looked it up correctly.
Microbiome Digest without the E's, yeah. So it's or just search for Elisabeth Bik. I do have a rescue account that is also called Elisabeth Bik, which you cannot follow. That's completely private. But Microbiome Digest is my handle, or search for Elisabeth Bik.
Yes, and your tweets are a lot of fun to follow. A lot about image tampering, and they're very interesting, eye-opening, and also quite a bit of fun to detect these tampering. I have to say, I'm not the best at it, but sometimes I do see them. Do you have any other websites or social media that you would like to share with our audience so that they can find you?
I have scienceintegritydigest.com. That's my blog. I don't blog a lot, but there's a couple of I have my financial disclosures there if you are interested in how I make my money. I have some guidelines on how to report papers or detect plagiarism, for example. So that's Science Integrity Digest is my blog. I have, from my previous career in microbiology, I have microbiomedigest.com, which is a website that is currently run by a small team, too small, of volunteers. That's about papers in the microbiology or microbiome space. So if you're a microbiologist interested in that, I would recommend that blog.
Okay. And you can always find us on thestrugglingscientist.com and on all social media. Jadon, which ones do we have?
Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and now also Mastodon.
Yes.
Yes.
Everywhere, of course, as a struggling scientist. Thank you so much for listening, and see you all next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.